Hey everyone, how's it going? My name's Mayuko and I'm a software engineer turned content creator making videos about tech, career, and life. So, in order to get a job in tech, or really any job at all, you need to undergo an interview process in order to see if you're fit for the role. And in the interview for a software engineer, we follow a typical 3-part process where at each stage, the difficulty and the duration gets longer. They test your fundamental coding skills, evaluate your technical strengths and weaknesses, and attempts to determine if you'd be successful at the job you're interviewing for. So these technical interviews are no doubt the most intense and probably most dreaded part of the interview process. Which, yes, in my own experience, the technical interview was the part that stressed me out the most. I always carved out time to study and prep for them, even if the work itself was pretty similar to what I was already doing at the job I was leaving, because I needed to sharpen my toolset to show my potential employer what I could do. Of course, what I studied and what questions I was asked in the interview changed over time as I became more senior, but my hope was always to convey what my technical strengths were to a company. And now that I'm a bit removed from the industry because I'm not actively working as a software engineer, I'm starting to see it from a different perspective because I'm not actively doing these interviews. Instead, I hear about them from friends and you all about how they're going. And I realize that there's a clear message that I'm starting to hear. And it's that technical interviews are broken. Now, this makes me stop and think. Just like whenever I hear that something is broken, maybe it's because of my past life as a software engineer, I really want to understand why and how it's broken. And in order to understand that, I realized that it gave birth to a bunch of these questions that I had about technical interviews. Like, what are they exactly? And what are they meant to do? And how did we even get here? Are technical interviews even like the best way to evaluate someone's skills in today's world? Or is it actually kind of a gatekeeping mechanism for those entering the industry right now? And are there any other alternatives out there? Well, this month, all of those questions kind of started to boil over, so I decided to finally tackle this topic. I did my research through articles and papers and interviews, some in part thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Formation, which trains their fellows to land jobs at top tech companies. I was able to meet and talk to members of their team who are really knowledgeable in this topic to learn more. And I'll tell you more about Formation later in the video, so stick around. So, I graduated from college in 2014, so a lot of my technical interview experience and knowledge was from around that time when I was looking for my very first job as a software engineer. But of course, the whole field and industry had been around for a while at that point, which meant that technical interviews were pretty common then too. But you know, I never thought to ask the question until now. How did we get here? Like, where did technical interviews even come from? Well, before we had our current industry, we had the .com era, and before that, it was semiconductors, and before that, well, you get the idea. So during the .com era, when software engineers had their first meteoric rise to hype, popularity, and power, Microsoft was arguably the most dominant player in tech at the time. During that time, the tide was changing from these old, well-established companies owning the industry to a fast-paced, uncertain, high-risk but high-reward tech scene. And for Microsoft at the time, Windows was the most widely used GUI operating system in the world, and Microsoft Office was taking the world by storm. So they needed to figure out a way to hire the best people in the market. The 2003 book by William Poundstone describes how Microsoft hired people, in that they needed to find the most intelligent, resourceful, and out-of-the-box thinkers needed to survive in the hyper-competitive business world. Bill Gates, the founder, was a huge fan of puzzles and riddles, and that became one of the main parts of the interview process. These are the times, by the way, when they would ask questions like, how would you move Mount Fuji, or how many piano tuners are there out in the world? There are other parts of the interview, of course, like technical overviews of past projects you've worked on, or abstract design questions, but by far, the puzzles and riddles questions had the most buzz. They believed that through asking those questions, they could see if someone would be willing to challenge assumptions and see things from novel perspectives. Which, in essence, is asking someone to demonstrate their problem-solving abilities. Of course, you don't hear much about those like puzzle and riddle type questions being asked in the modern day interview because the industry's morphed and evolved since the .com era. But you see the intentions of those questions being reflected in the modern day technical interview, in the need to test someone's abilities in solving novel problems. Now, before we go further, We need to define what we mean by technical interview because it's kind of a loaded term. And that's because there's a lot of different kinds of technical interviews out there. The most common by far is the data structures and algorithms interview. They're typically conducted in a 45 to 60-minute session in which an interviewer guides a candidate through a coding exercise. So in these data structures and algorithms questions, you might get questions like, how do you check if two strings are anagrams of each other? How is a binary search tree implemented? How is a bubble sort algorithm implemented? Other than these data structures and algorithms interviews, there's a lot of different kinds of technical interviews too. There's system design interviews, live coding interviews, pair programming interviews, take-home projects, and technical behavioral interviews, all which test different skills for software engineers at different companies, for different skills, and at differing levels. All these interviews, though, are roughly trying to test for a similar thing.
You're looking for constructive problem-solving technique. You're looking for fluent coding and effective coding. And in general, I would say that's coding in a way that clearly communicates the idea or translates the idea from the problem-solving phase into code in a way that avoids most of the bugs. I mean, we all write bugs, right? So like the expectation is not that there are 0 bugs at the outset, but it's that you write your code in a way that shows that you know how to avoid common mistakes. And then of course, at the end, you want the code to be bug-free. So there's a testing component. Like, can you now explore the code you've written effectively, write the tests, fix any bugs that are there?
That's Daniel Tomko, a software engineer who helped craft a lot of Facebook's interview process. But by far the most common technical interview is the data structures and algorithms interview. So I'm gonna primarily focus on that one for this video. Meet Adam. He's a 4th-year computer science student at the University of Waterloo, and he is no stranger to technical interviews.
I've done technical interviews at like dozens of companies. I guess like notable ones would be like Facebook and Citadel, Shopify, Square, Figma. So like mostly all in like the tech company, some fintech company kind of range.
I decided to interview Adam to understand what the technical interview process is like for students who are entering the industry right now. Because, you know, the tech industry changes at like a rapid speed, and I wanted to get a pulse.
I just felt that it was just luck, basically. That if you had seen the question on LeetCode before, then you would be able to solve it. I knew like to a certain extent that you could learn a lot of these concepts and be able to do them, but it felt like it was such a grind to get to that point and it was so unrelated to the job that you would be doing. It wasn't a great metric of my actual skills. Like I was confident in my abilities as a programmer, especially like building apps and stuff. But I wasn't confident in my LeetCode abilities. And I thought, how can that be? Like, how can it be that I wouldn't do well in the interview, but I think I would do well on the job? I also think that if you get a bad interviewer, it can feel pretty disheartening. If you go in and you're supposed to like this novel question that doesn't seem like there's any way you could have figured it out, and the interviewer isn't trying to push you along and give you pointers and tips, then like you're gonna walk out of that feeling like you got railroaded. And I've had that happen a couple times where like afterwards I'm like, I don't think there's anything I could have done differently.
Now, in a nutshell, from what I can understand from Adam and hearing from others who are breaking into tech, these are the reasons why technical interviews feel so broken. They're not a great way of assessing technical ability because what they test you on is so different from what you're actually going to be doing on the job. And that sometimes, if you don't get a great interviewer or an interview question, it can be really disheartening and cost you the job. I also asked people who were really well versed with technical interviews to get an opinion on the other side. And you know what? They said the same thing about them.
I think the biggest con, it's super obvious, is that it's not similar to day-to-day work. It's not similar in a number of ways. And there's just this incredulousness, like comparing like, okay, if I can reverse a linked list, how does that inform whether I can change the background color on your website? There's kind of like a comical element to like the mismatch between the interview process and then the job. There's a lot of like comicalness where people say that, you know, the tech industry is the only industry where the interview is the hardest part of the job. And then after that, it's like way easier.
That's Sophie Navati, the CEO of Formation. She's conducted thousands of technical interviews at top tech companies and now helps people to succeed in them.
1, you're not typically under such intense time pressure. 2, you typically have your standard IDE tools that you're used to, even with autocomplete or the syntax highlighting that you're used to, whatever tool you're used to, you're usually not doing that. Sometimes you're in a Google Doc, I've heard some companies do, right? So it's just like not the ideal environment. And then there's a lot of categories of questions that aren't similar to logic on a day-to-day level.
So, why might this be? Why do we use this as the standard interview process at different companies? And why does it feel so broken? Could companies give better interview problems that give a sense of what the work is actually like? And could companies provide better interview experiences for candidates by doing so? This is starting to get at why technical interviews feel so broken. And I think in order to understand this deeper, we have to look at it from the company side of what it takes to craft an entire interview experience. Because obviously, when a company is going to hire for a new person, they're going to try to find the best person for the job, and so there's a whole process for this. So in the interview process, they'll think about things like, what question to ask the candidate to get the best signal? What skills are they looking for in the candidate for this particular job? What signals interviewers are looking for to evaluate those skills? And how to conduct the interview in an unbiased and fair way that judges based on the performance in the interview. And basically what all these boil down to are two things that companies really need to figure out: how to evaluate the candidate and what to ask the candidate. Every job at a company comes from what's called a job rec or a job requisition, which is when a hiring manager submits a formal request to create a new position within the company. Employee salaries are typically the largest expense for a modern day tech company, and so hiring managers need to make a case for why they want to hire another person. They need to figure out what that person's going to be doing day to day and what skills are going to be necessary to make that person successful. Maybe it's the knowledge of a specific technology, or the ability to work fast, or being able to communicate different concepts with a lot of different people. In order to figure out what they're looking for, companies and teams need to understand who they are first. They need a level of self-awareness and to be realistic about who they are in order to find this new team member.
Concerted effort from engineers and engineering leadership to think deeply about what makes people successful in that company's environment. What do they need to know coming in the door? What can be taught on the job? What skills are important? What skills can we develop versus what skills do we need kind of coming in? And then thinking about questions that test those skills and a method for evaluating what's a poor performance on a particular skill versus a medium performance versus a high performance. It has to be done really deliberately.
And just like the self-reflection that we do in our personal life, this takes time and energy. Typically, this type of reflection and effort is led by the hiring manager, but it really needs everyone on the team, including the engineers, in order to arrive at some sort of consensus about who they are and what's important to them. Some people think it's HR's or human resources job to do this, but it really has to be the engineers themselves who are involved in this, since they know best about what's important to their job. Doing this work, therefore, usually requires several meetings, brainstorm sessions, documents, and reviewing and giving feedback to those documents and decision making. And this is actually one of those places where interviews can break. Some companies and teams just don't have time to do this kind of work, or they don't prioritize it because it takes time and energy away from development itself. Depending on the company culture, advocating for this type of non-technical work from engineers can be really tough, because some people view engineers' primary role to be about building and designing code. Personally, I think this is a great use of engineering time because hiring well means that you're building stronger teams. But even in my experience, product work, like shipping new features and improving existing ones, always took precedence over other work like cleaning up tech debt, writing documentation, or other intangible work. Honestly, sometimes it felt like pulling teeth to try to be able to work on stuff that didn't have a direct or measurable impact to the bottom line. So I can totally see how this is barrier number one for how technical interviews can feel so broken. But here's the thing, the work doesn't stop at just reflecting on what it takes to be successful at a company. It then needs to be translated into signals for what to look for in a candidate to suss out whether they have those skills or not. Most of the time, the end product is like a rubric or an evaluation evaluation guide that interviewers use to fairly and thoroughly assess someone's skills. Usually there's several categories that a candidate is assessed on using some sort of scale, which ultimately ladders up to whether that interviewer thinks that that candidate would be good for the job.
I think what's broken about coding interviews is if you don't have a rubric that's deeply connected to what's required for success on the job, then you're going to end up with a bunch of different problems. Number one, you're not going to get the right people. Number two, you may end up with a diversity problem, because one way, like if your rubric is, do they solve the problem? Your temptation might actually be to just ask really hard questions. And if you're asking really hard questions, then you're avoiding false positives, right? Well, they solved this really hard problem, so they must be good, right? But what you're doing, and that might be true, but what you're doing is then you're selecting for people that either spent the last year on LeetCode or have a CS degree from a top-notch university. And so you're eliminating people that might actually have a lot of ability and might be great engineers, but maybe don't have the same background. Instead, if you have a really clear rubric across a bunch of different signal areas, and then you're evaluating against that very carefully, then you can kind of unbreak the interview to some degree.
So let's walk through one of these rubrics to show you what they look like. Medium posted their grading rubric for engineering interviews in 2016. It's probably outdated at this point since it's 6 years old, but I still think it's a good example, so let's go over it. The categories that they graded on in the technical interview are the ability to build software, the ability to learn and teach, and a values alignment. In each of these categories, they define the signals they're looking for during the interview. For example, in the category for the ability to build software, they're looking for someone who can demonstrate problem-solving abilities, code fluency, autonomy, has a basic understanding of computer science knowledge, demonstrates resoluteness in finding a solution, and for senior positions, has strong skills in systems design. They grade each on a 5-point scale: strong no, no, mixed, yes, and strong yes, and give examples of what each look like in each of these categories. So for example, in problem solving, a strong no is when the candidate is unable to conceive of any solution to the problem. The candidate is able to describe a basic or naive approach, but is unable to implement it. And a strong yes is when the candidate clarifies the scope as a natural first step, is able to articulate multiple approaches and describe the pros and cons of each, makes a sensible decision based on the constraints of the interview format, and is able to fully implement the approach without any real help from the interviewer. The candidate recognizes edge cases and draws attention to them unprompted, then solves them. These rubrics are really helpful in calibrating interviewers on what a great interview looks like. Without a rubric, interviewers might grade candidates on the wrong thing, like things that are not that important to a company, things like getting the right or wrong answer, or getting to that answer in record speed. At companies where they have these rubrics, it's usually a core group of really passionate people who want to improve the interview experience who make it. But again, in order to make one that fully aligns with the team's goals and values, it really does take time, energy, and effort. Not to mention, once this rubric is made, there's a larger group of interviewers that need to be trained to interview in a way that aligns with the rubric. It takes a village to evaluate someone's skills, so everyone gets involved somehow, whether that be hosting technical interviews or behavioral interviews, or doing phone screens, or getting lunch with a candidate.
What many companies do is for interview training, it ends up being a meeting with somebody from HR. And that meeting is about the legal implications of interviewing. So you can't ask about this, again, you can't ask about that. And all of that makes sense, and all of that is good. That's the company covering their butt. And they should absolutely do that. However, that's not interview training. That's legal covering of butt. After that, what do you do? How do you take this person who now knows the legal rules around interviewing? How do you then turn them into somebody who knows how to evaluate a candidate for that role? And that part is lacking at most companies that I'm aware of. Some companies will just have you like shadow somebody who may or may not be good at interviewing themselves. Most of the companies that I've worked at don't actually have like internally published like rubric and method to their interview process. It's just sort of this word of mouth sort of training thing. And it takes time to put that together. And it's engineer time, which is expensive.
So we've already uncovered a couple of places where interview processes can break at a specific company. Evaluating what it takes to be successful there and what skills are necessary for the company, turning it into a thorough rubric that aligns well with the team, and training engineers to interview well based on that rubric and looking for the right signals. These are really important pieces of work that, sure, a hiring manager could take on entirely. But in order to create a good process, involvement from engineers is crucial. And unfortunately, some leaders or managers or even engineers don't feel that this work is as important as shipping code. This bias exists in a lot of places, and each one of those need to be challenged on their own. It takes time, trust, and a willingness from that individual or group to have their biases challenged in order for change to happen. So, you might have noticed that we haven't even talked about the interview question itself yet. And that's because only after the reflection and rubric and training happens can you even begin to think about what question to ask to the candidate. Which brings us to the next part where I think interviews can break. Now, before we move on, I want to say a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Formation. If you're watching this video because you're looking to land a job at a top-tier tech company, then definitely check out Formation's fellowship program. Sophie is actually one of the founders of Formation, and Daniel is part of the team too. They have a really unique program created by staff-level Facebook and Nextdoor engineers to create a better way to prep engineers for the industry. Once you've applied and been accepted into the fellowship, you'll get a personalized training plan made to fill your specific skill gaps, with direct mentorship from senior engineers to getting referrals directly into the top companies in the industry. The program lasts between 3 to 6 months, where they support you unconditionally until you land your dream role. You can do this part-time if you're currently working, and they also have an income share agreement, so you pay zero until you get hired. You can check them out and apply for free at formation.dev, which is also linked in the description box. Thank you again so much to Formation for sponsoring, and now let's get back to the video. So, these technical interviews are designed to be anywhere from 45 to 60, maybe even 90 minutes to allow for multiple of these sessions to occur within any given interview process. Which, let's be real for a second, that's not long. Assessing someone's technical abilities in a roughly 1 hour session requires a lot of skill. I mean, imagine having like a 45 to 90 minute conversation with someone, which at the end you have to decide whether you want to spend every day with that person. Like, I don't think I could even do that for friends, let alone coworkers. Anyway, because of the length of the interviews, the questions need to end up being contrived and well scoped, which is one of the cons to the whole technical interview that both Adam and Sophie brought up. But here's a thought. Could companies give questions based on the things that actually happen in their day-to-day? Well, yeah, but then it wouldn't fit into a roughly 1 hour session. In my personal experience, in order to be a contributing member of the team, there needs to be an enormous amount of onboarding before you can even expect to make an impact there. You need to learn about the company, the business, the code base that it uses, how the team uses different technologies, certain processes for development, and more. In fact, my team at Netflix told me that it'll take about 6 months to onboard just because there's so much stuff to learn. All these factors are important because when you're solving a problem, you have to make sure that you're solving the right problem so that you can arrive at the right solution. Contextual information can make sure that you do that because in software, the devil's in the details. Like, as an extreme example, imagine that as part of your interview, you need to build a feature that allows a user to post a comment. In order to build this, you need to know how to install the code base, run the application, make changes, commit to the repo, make a pull request, and send it to the right reviewer. And then once it gets approved, you need to make sure it gets deployed correctly. Not to mention you need to know or build the API that allows a user to post on a comment, which then you have to know where in the code base to go to for that and where to register that new API so that the clients can see it. You get the idea. There's a lot that you need to know in order to be able to solve this problem. Each company and team does things differently, so if this question was thrown at you during an interview, it'd kind of be a miracle if you can get it done. Because being an engineer is not just about coding. I actually really love how Sophie put it.
Being an engineer is really about combining programming logic with business logic. You are trying to build a sign-up experience where when you fill out this information and you click this button, an account gets created. And to do that, you're going to write some code to make that logic happen.
And so in order to give candidates a fair chance at solving a problem within a scoped period of time, you're gonna need to give them a smaller example. So, what kinds of questions can companies give to candidates? Granted, they need to make questions that work well no matter who the candidate is, because there's a lot of variables. Whether the candidate started to learn how to code in Python, Java, or JavaScript, where they learned how to code, what tech stacks they worked in previously, what product and services they worked on before, the processes they've used for building and deploying code, among many, many others. As a company, how would you find a question that is agnostic of all of that so you can find the right person for the job? Well, it goes back to the fundamental building blocks of software engineering: data structures and algorithms.
What data structures and algorithms is doing is it's really removing all of the fluff, I would say, of the business logic layer and really hyper focusing on the underlying programmatic logic only. So that's why a lot of data structures, you're working with nodes. So like you're working with a linked list or a binary tree, and each node has no meaning. In like your day-to-day programming, that node might be a profile object that is connected to another piece of data that has an intrinsic meaning. It's a beautiful thing that people are coming from way more different, varying, diverse backgrounds, both in terms of life experience, socioeconomic backgrounds, and past work experiences in terms of what they did previous to becoming a software engineer. What people have as skills are varying a lot more. In a world where every single person went through traditional university and had this background, then it's pretty fair to be like, okay, well, we're going to test you on that. And so now that people have more and there's so many different frameworks, right? So people have done all kinds of different tech stacks. It's become harder to design a process that is perfectly fair for every single person. But one of the pros is that it is actually quite equalizing in terms of the engineering background that you come from. So no matter what tech stack you've been on, what language is your primary language, right? Typically you're on a platform where you can choose from 30 different languages, which one, and no matter which web framework you came from, you can do kind of just the underlying raw coding exercise without being advantaged or disadvantaged from which previous experiences that you've had.
So in creating a data structures and algorithms type question, what exactly does that look like? Well, ideally, companies would give a question that resembles a real-world problem. Like for a front-end role, maybe it's a tree traversal question because the page DOM is literally a tree and that's really applicable for the job, but maybe not a dynamic programming question because that's not really applicable to most front-end roles.
Oftentimes, you can make interview questions out of things you encounter at work. Sometimes those data transformation steps make good interview questions because they're super practical. Coming up with other interview questions, it's a little bit more difficult. And there's definitely a bit of a challenge to make sure that they're novel enough. I have some strong opinions about what makes good ones. And in general, rule number one is they shouldn't require a cognitive leap, some sort of a eureka moment. They should be solvable by bringing to bear constructive problem-solving techniques, right? You should be able to explore the problem and ask questions about the problem and then answer those questions yourself. It shouldn't require some clever shift of perspective to suddenly see the elegant solution to the problem. Because then it just becomes a bit of a coin flip. Daniel's rule number 2 is that ideally the skills required for a given problem should be in some way applicable to the job content itself. If it's not connected in some way, then why are they asking this problem? What are they testing? If you do well on this problem or not, how does that correlate to your likelihood of success on the job? So, asking really difficult problems actually, I think, generally is counterproductive, because realistically, most of us as software engineers don't solve really difficult problems every day. Oftentimes we're working on like connecting systems together. And
so companies need to come up with questions that apply a lot of requirements. They have to be analogous to the job and meaty and novel enough to get a good signal, and are fair game to ask based on that role. And this is the other place where interviews can break. It's tough to come up with a question that works in a variety of situations, and again, it takes time and energy from engineers to do this. Of course, Daniel says that once you can find a good solution, you get a lot of mileage out of it.
I've been using the same handful of coding questions for many years now. I would say there's an advantage to using the same question hundreds of times as an individual, is that you become highly calibrated, right? You've seen people make every mistake possible on this problem. You've seen people approach it in many different ways. You're aware of what the pitfalls are, right? So you end up getting really good at giving hints.
So once companies figure out how to evaluate the candidate and give them a good problem to solve, then these technical interviews start to become less broken than what they get credit for. And even then, the interview's not going to be perfect, because you can only get so many signals from data structures and algorithms type questions. Like, you might miss out on how someone might work on problems collaboratively, if they can work independently and ship code, if they can communicate technical topics fluently to a lot of different people, and if they can take feedback on their code gracefully. And so of course, there's other types of technical interviews to get signals for stuff like this. Pair programming interviews, take-home projects, live coding interviews, technical behavioral questions. Because here's the thing, there isn't a one interview question to solve it all. There isn't a one-size-fits-all interview type that will unbreak interviews entirely. And that's because every team, every code base, and every company is unique.
I would really hesitate from saying there's like a universally good interview format in which if everyone did this, the problem is solved. It's also an evolving thing, right? Just like any product development process. Let's try something. Now that we've tried something, the entire industry as a whole is realizing there are cons to the ways that we're doing this, right? And so as an entire industry, we're all honestly trying to figure out better ways to do that. So I don't think there's a silver bullet. And I also think that the right choice will differ from company to company.
How and what code gets built has real world implications. Like, what business needs does that company have? Or what technical challenges does that code base present? Or what engineers are on the team, and what kind of values do they have when it comes to writing clean code? It would be disingenuous to create like a standardized test for whether a software engineer can really code, because everyone is looking for something different. Of course, every team and company has the responsibility to build out a thoughtful interview process that works for them, and arguably, some of them could really work on their interview processes. But I don't think technical interviews are entirely broken. I think maybe they're just not perfect. And I'm not sure if they'll ever be perfect across the industry, because it all depends on the individuals, teams, and companies to do what feels right for them.
I feel like there's a lot of like anger towards the interview process. I think it's kind of counterproductive for people to get there's like places that are going to be design interview processes that aren't aligned with your skills, and that's not a good fit for you. And that's great. You figure that out by not passing that process, and there's a company that's meant for you. And their interview hopefully is designed in a way that like aligns with your skills. And so, yeah, keep an open mind type of thing. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for watching today's video, and thank you so much to Sophie, Daniel, and Adam for being a part of it. If you'd like to support my channel to allow me to continue making these videos in the future, and you'd like some technical interview advice because I know that it's hard when you're going through it, then make sure to become a member where I'll share the advice that Daniel and Adam had for anyone going through the interview right now. Make sure to subscribe to my channel to see more videos like this, and I'll see you next time. Bye!